Well, Jim, earlier you brought up Pat Patterson. Let me ask a Pat Patterson-themed question here. This is a follow-up on a tweet that I saw, actually, that Dave Meltzer put out about the most influential people in the last 40 years in professional wrestling, and I believe Dave said that Pat was the second most influential when he stops and he thinks about it and he puts everything together in his head and comes up with an answer. Here's an email about it. This was sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Ron in Elyria, Ohio.
Elyria,
Ohio. I heard Dave Meltzer say Pat Patterson was the second most important man in wrestling in the last 40 years. I think Dusty Rhodes outdid him as far as what they contributed, performer, and what they did behind the scenes. Dusty made so many pay-per-views people are familiar with today. I know Pat was a great finish guy, but isn't Dusty's footprint a little bigger than Pat's? What say you?
I mean, it's not like it's widely off, but I still have to go with Pat because of the continuing, constant, up to the current time effect, whether impact, connection. Even when he wasn't full time, he was always there for the big stuff until just a few years ago. There were periods of time where Dusty didn't have, even in the 70s and 80s, where Dusty didn't have the pull that Pat Patterson did, and in as big a company. I mean, everybody can battle about creativity. My God, you can go back at Toots Mondt might have kicked both their asses for creativity when you're talking all time and over a 100-year period. But from the last 40 years, from 1980 to 2020, Pat had a more prominent position, really, behind the scenes, more influence on more guys for a longer period of time, and in a bigger company in most cases. Well, in all cases. When Dusty was in the WWF, he didn't have the pull that Pat ever did. That's not even knocking Dusty. That's just, goddamn, when you go as far as either one of those guys have gone, there's got to be some delineation from one to another, but it's still pretty fucking close. What do you think, Brian? This is your show.
I think Pat is more influential. Dusty had periods of time where he was one of the most important people in the business.
Yeah.
He was the booker for the second biggest company in the business that was the only one competing really head-to-head with McMahon in a lot of key areas. But
well, and also in the ring, you can have your cake and eat it too, because Dusty was never the in-ring performer that Pat Patterson was from an athletic and a working standpoint, not a psychological working standpoint, but just a standpoint of physically working. Pat was the guy there, but Pat was never one of the top 3 or 4 box office attractions in the business at any one time, which Dusty was more than once. So there's 2 ways of looking at the in-ring.
Who do you think was the better finish guy?
Honestly, Pat. Dusty had big ideas. Dusty was rotten on details. Dusty didn't care about the details, baby. It's all the big ideas, baby. And I mean, the finishes that Dusty is famous or infamous for, pretty much all were either learned from or flavored by Eddie Graham. And then you can see also the Roy Shire and the Bill Watts. Now that I'm learning more about Roy Shire and putting a lot of this together, and also the Dory Funk Sr. after the Amarillo book, you can see. So the thing is, Pat had more intricate finishes. Dusty liked to get the fucking heat, make the comeback, and get the fuck out of there and leave the people screaming. Pat built the old time, the other side of Eddie Graham, or the old time Roy Shire, what his shit built and built and built, and he had twists and turns, and it was a little more complicated side of that type of finish, and just had a little bit more roller coaster quality to it. So I think Pat was, but at the same time, Pat never sat down. Dusty shot everything at the fucking wall. You can't say that he didn't, but a lot of his shit stuck because of the power of his personality and the guys that he was able to pull together as a team and put them together and use them. He drew more money in a shorter period of time than anything that Pat ever booked really did, except for after the WWF national expansion. And somebody can say, well, goddamn, okay, but Pat still booked it. Well, they'd already got a head start on Crockett. Dusty made Crockett hot when Crockett was still a, 3 or 4 state territory and running Philly and Baltimore on the side. So they've each got their points.
And, you brought it up before that Dusty would leave people, standing up and screaming. There is that different philosophy based on the way the two companies did things differently. Typically, with very rare exceptions, and you can remember them pretty easily, WWF left fans happy. They left the arena happy. They got to see Hulk Hogan pose. When they didn't, like I said, you remember when Andre and DiBiase screwed Hogan. It was so memorable. The NWA, or Jim Crockett Promotions, you saw Ric Flair somehow walk out of there with the belt again, and you were furious. I mean, it was a completely different mindset.
Well, but also, that was kind of inherited by Pat, because that was the WWF style, because that was the WWF style in the 70s and even in the 60s. They didn't go for heat in the arenas because, I mean, let's face it, in the Northeast, where they'd had a riot, the big riot in 1957 in Madison Square Garden almost got wrestling shut down. Rocca and Dr. Jerry Graham and Bruiser and
Carpentier,
thank you. And they were afraid of riots, and they could very well happen in the old building in Philly, the downtown arena, in the Boston Garden. Blackjack Mulligan facing Pedro Morales for the WWF title. That was in 1972. It wasn't even like it was a big heat scene. It wasn't like that Morales had been fucked around and goddamn Mulligan was beating on him like the Cleveland riot with Ox Baker. It was just during the match with Mulligan and Pedro. I guess Mulligan had Pedro down, and the guy jumped in the ring with the knife, and from top to bottom, he got Mulligan. I think they said it started in the shoulder and went down the back for a while and then skipped and then went down the leg, the thigh some, but it was 200 and some stitches. He had to take like 3 months off. And the cops didn't even get the guy. Gorilla Monsoon ran out and grabbed the guy and bounced him to the cops, and they let him run off because they didn't know what the fuck was going on. So they always, not only that, they put the title match on. That started the tradition. A lot of people said it's because Hogan wanted to get out early and get back to the hotel. He benefited from this. But they put the title match on early in the show. It wasn't the last match like it was everywhere else in wrestling, or the main event. Whether it was title match or not, it wasn't the last match like everywhere else. They would make use of it to announce later on in the night, before they let the people go, the return match for next month or the main event for next month or whatever. But also it was so that the people would know there were more matches to come. They could get the main event on and get it out of there. The participants could get out so there wouldn't be trouble. And the people were less likely to riot when it wasn't the end of the evening. All that came into play, and that's how that tradition in the Northeast started. And that's why they left the people happy also, because they never beat Pedro. That's why they finally took the title off Pedro. They were having too many riots with the Puerto Rican and the Hispanic fans. If you did anything to fucking Morales, that's they wanted to. He wasn't drawing as well as Bruno did in some of the key markets, but he was selling out Madison Square Garden every month. But it was rowdy, and they wanted to make a change and bring Bruno back. But they beat Bruno with Koloff. And then in 71 in the Garden, and never even announced it, and didn't give Koloff the belt. He just went, and the people were silent in shock. But they beat Pedro out of town when he dropped it to Stasiak, right? Where was that? That was Philadelphia,
I think it was Philly, yeah.
It was Philly. And they would never even announce the babyface had lost when they did that. They'd just get the heel out quick. And remember, as a matter of fact, Koloff, I think that was in his book, is when he beat Bruno for the title and then lost it to Morales, they moved him out of the territory completely because they were afraid he had so much heat for being the guy that beat Bruno that it would start a riot just if he was there. He was attacked he was on a subway going to somewhere in New York, and he was attacked by some woman with a fucking umbrella or whatever because you beat Bruno, boom, boom, boom. So that's why they made people happy. In Southern wrestling and all the way out with traditional wrestling almost everywhere else, Vern was a kind of a different flavor altogether in the upper Midwest. He was more picky and choosy with his angles, but wrestling everywhere else, especially in the South, the towns were weekly or bi-weekly. There were smaller markets. You had riots, but the promoters didn't really fucking care because they had to draw money consistently. So you constantly had heat on your heels, and the baby faces had to climb a huge mountain to overcome it because people had to keep coming and buying a ticket every week over and over and over until they finally saw that. So that was wrestling centered on heat, and they had riots, but the buildings weren't as big. And I guess back in those days, I guess those fucking Northeastern fans were a mean bunch. But that's kind of the way it all started, and that was what Vince grew up on. So then it transferred over. Even when some of those things changed, the reasons behind those things were tradition and kept on like that. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And again, that was the different philosophy that the WWF had compared to the NWA or Jim Crockett Promotions specifically.